All right, so our first video dealt with the rhetorical situation. Like we talked about that kind of larger global issue about how arguments are constructed or what ideas are considered before delivering and crafting an argument. And we're going to move down here now. It's going to get a little bit more, what do I call it, if you're thinking about it, kind of like a reverse triangle. You have the very big kind of global issues that you have to think about first. And then we start moving into ideas about how do we structure and organize a speech or an essay. And this deals with the rhetorical appeals. Now, these are terms that maybe you heard before in a speech class or another writing class, but they are these Greek terms, ethos, logos, and pathos. And that's what we'll be talking about today in this video. So maybe this is a little bit of a review, but hopefully there are some new ideas that you can take away when we start thinking about the rhetorical appeals when it comes to structuring or organizing a speech or an essay. So just a quick review. The last video we talked about was the rhetorical situation. Like I said, it guides those choices that a writer makes when inventing, arranging, crafting, and delivering an argument for a specific audience. The rhetorical situation is context dependent and fluid. These things are always kind of shifting. If an audience changes, then how you establish credibility changes. Your ideas about the topic or information you provide for a topic will change. So all these things are always in flux depending on the context and the situation that you find yourself in. So again, our last video, we went through each step or each of these elements here of the rhetorical situation. Here's what it looks like visually. You might also remember the acronym SOAPS, which stands for speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, and subject, which again are encompassed all here in our visual of the rhetorical situation. So we move on here, and we're going to be talking about rhetorical or persuasive appeals. And I want you to remember that rhetoric is primarily focused on persuasion and the interplay between rhetor and audience. That is the key kind of focus when we're reading things rhetorically. That should always be at the forefront of our minds. So going back to our Greek philosopher Aristotle, who is again considered, the founder, the key person who defined or developed this study of rhetoric, he noted that there were three persuasive appeals that rhetors consider when developing an argument for a specific audience. And you again see this visual of the triangle because it works just so well. And there you see on the triangle, ethos, logos, and pathos. You'll also want to take note here about the arrows that I use here around the triangle. And I use these arrows to, again, show you that even though we're dividing this into three separate entities, these ideas are actually all interrelated and connected, very similar to the rhetorical situation. Ethos, logos, and pathos are always kind of working together. Logos, as we'll talk about, if you're providing information about the subject, will only enhance your ethos, or it will make you look more credible. But then you get to the idea of ethos, you're looking credible for this specific audience, the emotions. You'll start seeing how these things work together. So even though we're going to break it down into, say, here are the three appeals, important thing to take note of is that they actually work together. They're always, again, in flux. One informs the other. So ideas to take note of here before we get started to each individual appeal is, do take note that on the triangle, the rhetorical situation links up with each of these appeals. So for example, subject is connected with logos, rhetor is connected with ethos, and audience is connected with pathos. And again, just a quick reminder, these ideas are interrelated. Even though we're isolating them, they all work together during the course of an argument. So keep that in mind when we start reading some of these texts in the coming days, that even though we will break it down, we have to think of it as ideas that are informing one another. So ethos, this is also known as the ethical appeal. Ethos is basically asking you to consider how the rhetor presents themselves to the audience. It focuses on credibility or authority of the rhetor, but also think about it as a connection to the audience. Now, this is again where it kind of leads in or goes in with the idea of pathos. Although pathos deals more about how do you evoke specific emotions, or what specific emotions the rhetor is evoking in the audience. This idea of connecting to the audience. There's this great quote by a rhetorician named Kenneth Burke. It says, "You persuade a man only insofar as you can talk his language by speech gesture, tonality, order, image, attitude, idea, identifying your ways with his. Okay, and this is something really important to think about when you think about how do writers establish this connection with their audience. You think about, presidential elections or campaigns, and one of the first things that they usually will do, these speakers, they'll get up there and they'll try to make themselves a man or a woman of the people. Even though they have, usually a lot more wealth, a lot more education, a lot higher social standing, they will do anything that they can to show that they are, representatives of the voting electorate, of the middle class, or depending on what audience they're talking to, they will make a strong effort to show that they are one of them. Speak their language and connect with that audience, because if you don't have that connection, chances are your audience is not going to buy what you're selling. And again, if your chief goal is to persuade or move this audience to action, you got to show that you are one of them. So then we go into this other appeal, which is called logos. Now, in years past, they used to refer to this as the logical appeal, but I'm changing that, and I want you to think about this as not just strict logic, but rather the rational appeal, or basically, does this argument seem reasonable or rational? And I'll explain why that's a different thing to, or an important thing to take note of here in a moment. So basically, this is the appeal that drives your argument. It's the reasons and the evidence and support and conclusions you present to your audience. So again, when I have reasons or evidence, it makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about. It enhances that credibility, but it also makes the argument as a whole seem like something that's a reasonable or rational idea to accept. So this again goes into the basic idea of how do I construct or structure the argument, how it opens, continues, and closes, what the argument contains and the veracity or the truthfulness of the argument, the reasoning, is it logically reasoned, or does it seem far-fetched? And then it's the strengthening of an argument through recognition of a counter-argument. Again, do I understand that there are opposing viewpoints to my version of truth, and how do I address and recognize those? So that basically makes everything sound more rational or logical when you are appealing to this sense of logos. But I want to make a very important note here. Although logos is closely connected to logic, there is a difference. Formal logic with math, and that's usually when we think about logic, is the idea of absolutes. But with rhetoric, we're not dealing with absolutes here. We deal with probabilities and belief rather than certainties. So the idea is that, even though we have, evidence and things to support it, conclusions, strong reasoning, we are not dealing with an absolute truth. We are not dealing with that math kind of idea of absolutes. We're dealing with the idea of, well, do we have a strong sounding argument? Is it probable that what I'm arguing is true? And that's an important distinction to make, because no argument is absolute. There are always ways to look at it and kind of maybe undercut it or present a counter argument. That's how we get back to that larger idea about arguments are versions of truth with evidence and support. There are tons of versions of truth out there that can be argued. So it's an important distinction to make, that it's not necessarily absolute logic, absolute truth. Rather, we're dealing with certainties and probabilities. Leading us into the final rhetorical appeal, known as pathos, or the emotional appeal. Pathos focuses on the audience's emotions. How does the rhetor evoke the emotions of a specific audience is really an important thing to consider. When you see some of the emotions that you can try to evoke, sadness, pity, fear, excitement, love, patriotism, amusement, etc. You can go on with any type of emotion. And the key thing to consider with the emotional appeal is that it is a shared emotion between the rhetor and the audience. And I just put a quick note here when you think about humor and laughter. When you make a joke that gets a lot of laughter, it's because you share a common belief or a common idea, a common mindset with you in the audience that you're delivering that joke to. If a joke falls flat, if you do not evoke laughter, it's because there's some type of breakdown between you, the joke deliverer, and the audience that's receiving the joke. So the key thing with the emotional appeal is that you're trying to establish this shared emotion. And this is the idea of evoking any type of emotion. This is usually thought of as the strongest rhetorical appeal. Ethos and pathos are your stronger rhetorical appeals because it's that idea of sharing a connection. Oftentimes it will win out over the logical or the rational appeal. Logos is kind of lower down there on the totem pole. If you're going to really try to convince people to do something, if you can make a strong connection with them as a rhetor and share an emotion or evoke these strong emotions in them, chances are you will be able to persuade them to achieve your aim or your intention that you set out with the argument. One important thing to note when we talk about or discuss the rhetorical appeals in this class or in your writing, rhetors appeal to an audience's sense of ethos, pathos, and logos. Rhetors do not use ethos, logos, or pathos like they use a simile. This is not a device. That's a term we'll start talking about when we think about, similes or metaphors or, an anaphora. These are considered rhetorical strategies or rhetorical devices. You don't use ethos, logos, or pathos. Rather, these are ways to think about how do I talk about this or how do I write about them. A rhetor develops his or her ethos through a narrative at the beginning of the speech. They appeal to his or her audience's emotions, or they evoke a sense of fear by using strong, language or something like that. Or the rhetor presents a reasonable claim by using statistics and recent facts of a court case or something like that. Those are the ways I want you to think about discussing and writing about the rhetorical appeals. They're not a device, rather they are appeals, or they evoke certain things, they develop or they present these ideas. They don't use them. So keep that in mind. This will be kind of a new way to think about talking about language in your writing and reading. But as we go along, don't say they use it, rather they develop it, enhance it, present it, something like that. So a quick wrap up here just to bring things to a closure here. Remember that ethos, logos, and pathos relate to the interplay between rhetor and audience. Okay, so this idea of interplaying, connecting, working with one another goes back to the idea of rhetor and audience, that connection between those two. The three appeals connect to the 3 points from the rhetorical triangle that represent that rhetorical situation: subject, rhetor, and audience. Each of those rhetorical appeals link up to subject, rhetor, and audience. And then even though we break up the appeals into the 3 separate parts, remember that they are in fact working together in any argument. If you are enhancing your ethos or you're making yourself look credible, you are basically showing that you're knowledgeable about the subject or the topic, and you are also making those strong connections to the audience. They're always working together. So remember that even though we break them up, they are in fact working together to try to help that rhetor move that audience to action to achieve their given intention or purpose.